Anyone else want some mac and cheese? Malcolm and Marie was written and directed by Sam Levinson and stars Zendaya and John David Washington. It tells the story of a couple who get into a heated argument after coming home from a movie premiere. Though it's actually been a while since I talked about a movie on this channel, it's mostly been about WandaVision, but now that Netflix has some new releases coming out every week, I think it's time I started talking about them. This was an interesting one. I like both John David Washington and Zendaya in the roles that I've seen them in over the years, and so it was interesting to see these two together on screen. I was also interested to hear that this was made under very minimal circumstances. This was made during the pandemic, so they had a smaller crew, only 2 actors on set. They had one location, which was this house, and all of it does feel very contained and personal. Now, I can't say I loved this movie, but I was interested in it, and I do think there is definitely some great stuff in here. But overall, I wouldn't say this is a movie that I'm absolutely mind blown over, but there's definitely some stuff to appreciate, so let's get into it. Like I said, this movie was made under minimal circumstances, but they were able to make the most out of this situation. There's some great cinematography in this movie. I like the black and white. Really great shots, really great compositions. I think there's a lot of frames you could just take out of this and it would be a very beautiful photograph. I also think that the performances were pretty strong in this one. John David Washington and Zendaya. This whole thing rests on them because they're the only people you see on screen. I think they both did really, really great performances. In terms of the characters, I feel like I related a little more or was more invested in Marie's side of this story because this whole situation is you're trying to unpack what's going on in between them. But John David Washington's character, Malcolm, I think he did bring up some good points and had some interesting moments here and there. But I feel like his character was harder to get behind because a lot of his arguments sometimes came off as him like just being really whiny and kind of conceited, selfish. So he just seemed like a terrible person very early on in the movie, and so it was hard to kind of see his side. But there are moments when they have this back and forth, and you do see he brings a certain perspective that you didn't expect to see from him, if that makes sense. Like, his arguments get really personal, but then you also get to see a little bit of his side. You get to see where he's coming from. So it does sort of make sense, but when you look at him as a person, you're like, yeah, this guy sucks. Why is Marie still with this guy? With Marie, you see that she's kind of over this situation, she's over this relationship. She's kind of been bottling up a lot of these feelings, and Malcolm doesn't really seem to notice what's bothering her, why she's so mad about this situation that they're in. But again, you keep hearing more and more of their backstory, and it starts to make more sense why she feels the way she does. And again, you see Malcolm being a total jerk, so you totally understand where she's coming from. Structurally, I do think they managed to keep this movie interesting, but I do think it kind of falls into this rhythm where they're arguing, then one person brings up something personal, and then turns into a monologue where one person's like yelling at the other. Then they storm off and they don't talk to each other for a little bit. They come back together and it's all lovey-dovey until somebody says something else that's triggering, and then they break into another argument. It gets in this cycle and it kind of becomes a little predictable in that way, where you can kind of see where it's going, where they keep going back and forth. That's part of it though. It's an argument. It's supposed to be this real couple and you're kind of peeking into their life, and so it feels like they can't really escape this argument. Malcolm keeps trying to change the subject or trying to like sleep with Zendaya's character Maria, but then something else comes up and they get back into an argument again. It's this constant cycle. And then you kind of wonder, why are these two still together? Like, clearly they don't work out, but for some reason you see them keep coming back together. And I think that's kind of part of it, is trying to figure out what really went wrong here, what brought these two together, why it seems like one person cares more than the other. Like, there's definitely layers to it. Now, I mentioned earlier that Malcolm was kind of harder to get behind as a character, and I think part of that was that some of the stuff he was arguing about or complaining about was just kind of dumb. Like, there's a moment where he's going on this big rant about this movie reviewer who, generally speaking, gives him a positive review, but it's the way she writes it. And I think to a degree I understood where he was coming from, but even Marie mentions that, well, she did say this and she is calling you this and this, which is kind of like how I felt as an audience member watching him have this long, almost tantrum. And so for that, I feel like it was kind of hard to get behind him. And again, he was saying some really messed up stuff, some really personal stuff. He really jabbed at this girl, and she even says that he's verbally abusing her because he's just saying so many things and he's just yelling, and it's so hard to get behind him. But again, you ultimately understand where I think both of them are coming from, both their perspectives. Now, one thing is the script wasn't perfect. I think generally speaking, it was pretty good, but there were some moments that were weird or didn't feel natural. It didn't feel like stuff people would normally say, if that makes sense. It did feel very exposition heavy at points, or moments where they were saying a lot of stuff that I don't think necessarily sounded like how a person would naturally say something, if that makes sense. And that sometimes came through the performances too. But overall, I would say the dialogue worked, and I think the whole discussion element of this movie was a good driving force. And then one last thing I'll say is the song choices were interesting. There are definitely moments where I think the characters weaponized some of these songs against each other as a way to kind of subliminally say how they're feeling, which I thought was interesting. And it is just a nice soundtrack too, nice score. So visually, I think this movie looked really nice. It's impressive that they're able to do all this under the constraints of the pandemic. I think there's some really strong performances here, and it is on Netflix, so if you have a subscription, definitely check it out. The verdict. I think Malcolm and Marie is a great time. This movie's not going to be for everyone. If you're someone that doesn't like dialogue-driven movies that don't have a lot of action or a lot of just things happening on the screen where it's mostly people talking in a room, having long discussions, if you don't like that kind of stuff, this is probably not going to be the movie for you. But if that sounds like that's up your alley, then I definitely think this is worth checking out. So what did you think of Malcolm and Marie? Let me know down in the comments. Also, don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.